there are lots of similarities between China and the Russian, or I should say between China and the Soviet Union. So based on your knowledge about Russian, what kind of suggestion do you have to our government so that we could avoid the mistakes which has made by Soviet Union?
Well, I wrote about it before it happened. I wrote my article in 1992 making a prediction about what would happen. So at that time, it was not analysed afterwards. That was why the article made my reputation, because it said the full privatisation of industry in Russia is going to lead to a disaster, right? Mm-hmm. China's policy of Deng Xiaoping is going to lead to a big economic success, right? It then led to a disaster in Russia, right? GDP fell by about 50% between 1992 and 1998. After 1998, Russia adopted some more sensible policies. The most fundamental thing has already been done by China, which is not to privatise the big state industries, right? So therefore, that's the most important. Now, I know that some people still campaign for the privatisations of the industries, because really there is an attempt in China to overturn Deng Xiaoping's theories, right? Deng Xiaoping's most famous statement is, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, provided it catches mice. Right, okay. What this means is, we don't judge whether it's state or private to be better or worse. We only judge it by depending how well it performs. But now, some people are trying to say, yes, one of the cats is better than the other cat. It does matter whether the cat is black or white. The private cat is good, and the state cat is bad. Well, that's to overturn Deng Xiaoping's theories. That's not to do it, and you can see it. For example, there's a recent list of the Chinese companies increasing their position in the Fortune Global 500. China is number 2 in the world after the United States. Right, okay. Some people say most of these companies are state companies. Right, okay, well, what would Deng Xiaoping reply? Deng Xiaoping would say, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, provided it catches mice. So in other words, it doesn't matter whether these are state companies or private companies, these are big successful companies. Some people are writing, oh no, it's very, very bad that these big successful companies are state companies. So they want to overturn Deng Xiaoping's theories, right? There are two groups of people in China who want to overturn Deng Xiaoping, right? One is people who want to go back to the economic system before 1978. I'm afraid I don't agree with them. I know some of these people are very patriotic and China, and they may have good intentions, but I'm afraid I don't agree with them, right? Okay. There is a second group of people who want to overturn Deng Xiaoping's economic policies, which are people who want to have the private economy. Whereas Deng Xiaoping said it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white, they say it matters very much indeed whether the cat is black or white, right? And this is wrong. And this will lead China into another economic disaster, right? So that's that. Then there are certain consequences. Now, it doesn't incidentally mean that trying to put these policies will have the result which they want. For example, I think, while in general I support China's economic policies, in my opinion some mistakes were made in the first half of the year. I don't agree with the theory of putting up wages. I don't agree with the theory that wages should increase faster than GDP. I think that wages should increase in line with GDP, because the real reason is that the increase in wages faster than GDP will decrease the profits of companies. And now, nobody is so stupid as to put forward the slogan that we must reduce the profit of companies. But if you put up wages more rapidly than GDP, as the GDP consists of only wages and profit, therefore if you put up the percentage of wages, you must decrease the percentage of profits. Therefore, in the first part of this year, there was a profits crisis of companies. That's why the economy slowed down. I don't agree with this. Because then what will happen is the population's income will go up more slowly. And we know the data shows that in the first 6 months of 2013, the income of the population went up more slowly than in the first 6 months of 2012. This is a very practical demonstration of the question that you can't have rapid increase in income without a rapid increase in GDP. So therefore, it's also necessary to avoid certain, sort of short-term mistakes. So the fundamental one, there is no big, I'm in favour of privatising small enterprises. I think small enterprises are competitive, that's fine. But the most important thing, which is not to privatise the big state enterprises, is already done. But of course the trouble is that some people want to overturn it. And then that will produce the same economic disaster as in Russia. That was why there was a big debate about it. It's not a debate about Russia. It's a debate about what are the consequences of privatising the big state-owned enterprises in China. It's not a debate about Russia, it's a debate about China. But in order to try to win the debate in China, they have to falsify the data about Russia, but I happen to know it's false.
So, am I right? In your opinion, you think the big state-owned enterprise is really essential for the Chinese economic development at this moment?
Yes, absolutely. They're the real question is in China is to have a very high rate of investment. In the world, 57% of economic growth is due to investment. Right, the reason for the financial crisis in the West, or the reason for the economic crisis in the West, is the fall in the rate of investment. As investment accounts for by far the highest percentage of economic growth in the world, if China has a low rate of investment, it can't have a high rate of growth. But if you want to have a high rate of investment, that means that the state has to be able to control enough of the investment system to make sure that the investment level can move up and down. For example, in the United States, well, supposing they decided they wanted to have a much higher level of investment, well, they can't do it because there are no state enterprises to carry out a high level of investment. They would have to create a whole series of state enterprises to carry out a high level of investment. They don't exist. In China, they exist. So therefore, maintaining the big state enterprise is absolutely necessary in order to maintain the government's ability to regulate the level of investment in the economy. I think it's also necessary for international competition, but that's a slightly secondary question.
Yeah, so actually the state-owned companies is our advantages.
Yes. Well, why do you think that the Americans want to make them inefficient? Right. It's a very strange argument that the United States has. The United States says China's state enterprises have a competitive advantage because they don't pay dividends. Which is true. The big advantage a state company has is it doesn't have to pay dividends to a private shareholder. The private shareholder takes 5 to 7% of the dividends. So therefore, the state enterprises are lower costs. So what the United States says is that the Chinese state enterprises should pay dividends. In other words, the Chinese state enterprises should become as inefficient as the American private enterprises. But that's a very strange argument. The argument should be, on the contrary, that America should have a lot of state enterprises so that it could compete with China. The argument that Chinese state enterprises must be made less efficient because China has the advantage that the Chinese state enterprises are more efficient than the private enterprises in the United States. The formula which I always use, which is correct, is nobody, if you look at the competitive position of China, I don't think he has to worry about the United States. Nobody can murder China. It's too big and too powerful, right? The aim of people is to persuade China to commit suicide, right? That's the only way to defeat China. And that's what really all the neoliberal stuff in China is to do. It's to persuade China to commit suicide. Right. So, no, I don't. So it's the reason I don't really think that China has to think very much about the policy. It has to think about it from the point of view of how good export prospects are. I think China has made some mistakes in the last 2 years by overestimating the economic growth in the West. Not hugely, but it didn't reach 10% growth rate for trade last year. On present policy, I don't think it would reach the 8% target for exports this year. I haven't studied the new measures. Yesterday's new measures may make a difference. But apart from that, everything is decided inside China. There's nothing. I don't expect a big crisis in the United States. I just expect slow growth, 2% a year. Everything is determined by the fact of whether China can be persuaded to commit suicide or not. And that's the goal of the neoliberal policy in the next 5 to 7 years, is to persuade China to commit economic suicide.
Okay, in terms of commit suicide, could you give us more specific details, just like what kind of law measures we may adopt in the future may cause this kind of suicide?
Well, it's very simple. All you need to do is study Japan, because Japan is a country which committed economic suicide. It was one of the most successful economies in the world, and then after 1973 it committed economic suicide. It committed economic suicide because of the political pressure of the United States. Its military alliance with the United States. The United States demanded from Japan policies which slowed down the Japanese economy. There were three. One was to have a very much overvalued currency, because if you have a very overvalued currency, this will slow down an economy very quickly, right? And this is why the United States has put continual pressure on China to raise the exchange rate of the yen, because to the yuan, to increase it in the same way that had the exchange rate of the yen too high. That would slow China's economy. The second is to reduce its rate of investment, because the rate of growth of the economy is determined by its rate of investment. Now, it doesn't say, well, actually some people do say you should reduce the level of investment, but mainly it says you should raise the increased rate of consumption, but that will have the same effect. Right? In that case, if China cuts its level of investment, then the economy will grow much more slowly. The third one is to persuade other foreign companies not to invest in China. It is not important for China financially whether foreign companies invest in it or not. China has enough money, but the technology and managerial skills, particularly the technology of foreign companies, is still very useful to China. That's why there are constantly stories saying that some other economy is more successful than China. 2 years ago, everybody was writing India is going to be more successful than China. The Economist had a front cover saying the Indian economy will grow more rapidly than China. Okay, that's impossible to say anymore, because the Indian economy is going through a bit of a crisis at the moment. So now they've discovered that Mexico is the big place. So instead of foreign companies investing in China, they should be investing in Mexico. And if Mexico has a crisis, they'll find somewhere else. You know, you should all invest in Kenya or something like that, right? You know, it doesn't matter. Not anywhere but China. So those are the three things: an overvalued exchange rate, lowering the level of investment, and persuading foreign companies not to invest in China. Those are the three measures. I mean it very seriously. China is too powerful to be murdered. Therefore, it can only be persuaded to commit suicide. This means that all the important decisions are taken in China. China has its own fate in its own hands. Mm-hmm. It is very, very close to achieving what in China is called national revival, or put it, a reasonable standard of living, whatever you want to call it, right? A good standard of living, national revival. It's only 10 or 20 years away from it, right? Therefore, the pressure to try to persuade China to commit suicide from the outset has to be very, very quick. 5 to 7 years, China will be bigger economy than the United States. It won't be stronger, because the American companies are still bigger, the technological level is still higher. I don't think China will be the strongest economy in the world until about 2030, right? And then my approach is, I'm not Chinese, so I can't start off from what is the interests of China, right? What I believe very profoundly is that everybody's equal and everybody is different. That's my most fundamental belief. So if you think that you are better than somebody else, then I don't think you are, and I think you should be reduced down a bit, right? Which is, as the United States government thinks is better than other people, I just point out, no, they're not. They're spying, they're lying, they're organising coups. The problem in China is the other way round, which is that people in China think they're less good than other people. So the problem in China, in order to get people to be equal, is to persuade them that no, you're not any less good. This is the famous question which is discussed of, lack of self-confidence, etc., in China. So that, all I do is, China is the most important question in the world. It's got no more rights. For example, take another group of people, the black population in the United States. Right. The black population in the United States has been subject to the most disgusting and disgraceful attacks for 200 years, right?
Till now.
Until now, it still continues. It started with slavery, it continued with discrimination, and the problem is still not solved 200 years later, right? Okay. They have no more, the Chinese people have no more right in that sense than the population in the United States. The black population in the United States has suffered historically just as much as the Chinese people have suffered, right? Okay. The difference is that China is very powerful and China is very close to solving its problems. Many African countries, for example, also suffer, much worse social conditions than China, but they can't solve the problem now. You've got to be practical. Their suffering is huge. In the future, hopefully they will overcome this problem, but I'm afraid it can't be solved just now, right? Or India. I love India. I think it's a wonderful country, right? I visit it a lot. But it doesn't have the right economic policies. It can't solve its problems very quickly. 20, 30 years it can. The difference is in China in the next 10 to 20 years, China can solve most of its problems. And if it will solve most of its problems, then, for example, if you take the present percentage of the population in the world which lives in high-income economies, by World Bank definition, is 16%. Right? China is 19% of the world's population. China should be able to become a high-income economy in about 12 years' time. This will more than double the percentage of the population of the world living in high-income economies. Now, I understand the Chinese people understand that this is a big step forward for China, which it is, obviously, right? But it's also a big step forward for the human race, right? I understand that that's not why people in China are undertaking it, and I don't believe, I'm sure there are a few individual people in China who understand this, but the great majority of people in China don't understand this. Neither do I think they should. But that is its objective effect, right? So therefore, that's all, I'm interested in. It's that China is the place in the world where the biggest step forward for humanity can be taken at the present time. So therefore, obviously, I'm very deeply interested in the question.
So actually, you have the confidence to China to solve all the problems we are facing now in our economy by ourselves, by the Chinese people.
Yes, not extremely quickly. Some of them are simply, I gave you, there's 10 kilometres of railway track for every person in the United States and 10 people for every kilometre in China. I always say to my class, I wish I could tell you that if you had the right idea, you can go out of the room and the problems of China will be solved. This is the stupid thing that the neoliberals say. If China adopts some, the American system or something, the problems will be solved. Well, they won't. A lot of the problems are just going to take a very long time. Some of the problems can only be solved in 20 years, right? But the question is, there is no problem inside China which cannot be solved by China. That's why I don't mean it to be words, right? I mean that only by China deciding to commit suicide can it not succeed in what in China is called national renewal, right? Because all the preconditions for the success in that exist inside China. But of course then very powerful forces in the world are trying to persuade China to commit suicide, right? Because they don't want it. It's not true that the United States wants, or no, let's be careful. Let me, because we're talking a very serious subject. I won't talk about the United States, because there are many different views in the United States. As regards the population in the United States, this can be strategically one of the most important allies China can have, because the population in the United States really wants to be left alone. They have a very big country. They have a very high standard of living. No one is going to militarily attack them. So they're fine. They just want to be left alone. Right, okay. The problem for them is that the US government leads them into all sorts of things like the Vietnam War or the invasion of Iraq. At the time, unfortunately, the population of the United States thinks that they should support this. Only later, unfortunately, when thousands of Americans have been killed, or there's a big crisis in the US economy, do they realise that the Vietnam War was a big mistake, that the Iraq War was a big mistake, right? So the formula is other countries have to be very strong, so that if the United States tries to do something very bad, they can resist it. And then the American population, after 3 or 5 years, will say this was a very bad idea, we don't want to do it. No, who defends the Vietnam War in the United States? I don't know anybody who defends the Vietnam War in the United States. The majority of people oppose the Iraq War, but the point is China has to be very strong to resist that. But the difference is, I'm afraid, if you have a small country like Vietnam or Iraq, well then somebody can murder you, right? The positions of the United States are no worse towards Iraq or Vietnam or China. The difference was that Iraq or Vietnam are smaller countries and therefore the United States can murder them. China is not. China is a huge country. Nobody in the United States is planning a war with China. And well, I mean, the generals have to do for formal reasons, but I mean, no American politician really wants a war with China, right? Because they know China's too powerful. The aim must be to try to persuade China to make such big mistakes that its growth rate falls, etc., etc. So therefore, it's like watching the biggest drama in the world, and I can't do very much because all these decisions are going to be taken in China, and they're going to be taken in China by Chinese people. They're not going to be taken by anybody else. So all I can do watch this, but this is the most important matter in the world, and the biggest drama, the biggest economic development in the world, the biggest drama in the world. I feel so frustrated. 10 or 20 years and China will have solved its problems. That's all. I mean, not all its problems, but because life will go on and there will be difficult problems. But how to achieve a high income economy, how to achieve huge national defence capability such it can't be attacked. These types of problems can be solved.
So if they want to murder China, apparently they will make it like actually it's China commit suicide by ourselves.
Well, no, you can't murder China. China is too powerful. Right, okay. Let's take Vietnam. Right, Vietnam is a small country and could be attacked by the United States, bombed, invaded, etc. Therefore, Vietnam could be murdered. Iraq could be murdered. It could be invaded. It is impossible to invade China. Not even the maddest American general thinks of having a military conflict with China. China can defend itself. It has to be persuaded to adopt the wrong economic policies. The economic policy of China, therefore, is the most important question which exists in the world, because it's the question whether the national revival of China will succeed or not.
Right.
So that's why I say can't be murdered, can only commit suicide.